Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into America's political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Well, thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 7th day of June. It is a beautiful Tuesday in early June 2016, and it is a pleasure to be with you on this, our second consecutive day of broadcasting here on the Virtual Center. I hope that your day is going well, and I trust that in the next hour and a half, we can contribute to the quality of your day. I hope that by tuning into our program today and reacting to it, and of course one way is to listen, and another way is to respond. And I hope that some of you will choose to respond, and I'll get into the details of that in a minute. It is primary day, and the last of several primaries is scheduled today. And, of course, the big one's California. But as many of you know, the pundits, the numbers crunchers as well, kind of concluded last night that Hillary had reached the magic number. And, of course, that's counting the superdelegates, many of them that are already theoretically pledged to her. But in terms of pledged delegates that are the result of the primary, what the voters have done on the primary, obviously Hillary does not have the nomination yet. And I think Bernie has made the point, I know Bob Kincaid has made the point as well, that the superdelegates don't really cast their ballots until the convention in July. So in theory, there is some question, obviously, as to whether, in fact, suggesting that the primary campaign is already over and everything is locked up, maybe a little bit presumptuous. On the other hand, I just a few moments before we went on the air posted an entry on Facebook dealing specifically with this problem or this issue, and I'd like to get back to it and open our program perhaps with that today as well. Actually, there are a couple of entries on Facebook that I'd like to address at the beginning of our program today. And then I want to return to an issue that we closed yesterday's program with, which is associated with the name of the retired Marine Corps commander, Brigadier General, I believe, Smedley Butler, in 1933. We read excerpts from a speech he delivered in 1933, which was very, very critical of the influence of corporate America over government policy during that period. I'd like to return to that and provide a few more details, a little bit of flesh to go in the bones, so to speak. And that really is the thrust of what I think will probably comprise the bulk of our program today. Then, I think where we'll be going tomorrow, we could begin it today, but if we don't, we'll certainly be into it tomorrow. And it really gets us back to the issue of Citizens United and to the whole issue of the idea of corporations, in theory, being self-regulated as opposed to the right of regulating corporations and regulating what corporations do. And that gets us directly into the First Amendment issues of free speech as well as free press. And I think that will get us into a whole different set, a whole new set, if you will, of substantive issues related to this. This is a very complicated, I think, a deep and rather convoluted issue, but I think it is absolutely critical. I believe it is, and that's why I think that devoting time to it here at the Virtual Center is more than justified. I mentioned a moment ago that active listening is obviously a form of participation, and I can't emphasize that enough. It seems to me, and I try to do the very best I can to make these programs substantive. In other words, to to inject our programs with as much content, as much substance, and as much analysis as I can possibly bring to the table. The result, I believe, is that many of these issues that we deal with here at the Virtual Center are issues that really demand some reflection, some pondering, some thought, maybe some additional research, maybe some reading. I don't think these are the kinds of things you can kind of sit back and say, I agree or I don't agree, and then pass it on and go to the next issue. I hope that I'm raising the kind of questions, I try to, that really generate some questions in your mind and cause you to do something in response to what we do here at the Virtual Center. If indeed that's happening, then you are participating in the program, whether in fact your participation goes beyond that or not. But we do invite you to make your role in our program even more active and more participatory than that. We would love to hear from you and actually engage you and your ideas, your thoughts, your suggestions, your concerns, your criticisms, your hopes, whatever, around some of these issues. For that, we have a phone number, and we have reserved the line specifically to give you an opportunity to go on the air and share your thoughts with our other listeners as well as with me. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And of course, as we know, 4676 translates on your keypad, on your phone pad to H-O-R-N, horn. If you would be a little bit reluctant, perhaps, to get on the air, but at the same time you'd like to express your ideas and share them with me via an email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's W-A-O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, all one word, lowercase, at gmail.com. And then again, we do have our Facebook page, and it's been quite active recently. In fact, as I just mentioned, I put 2 postings on it just this morning. So, in fact, I'd like to open today's program by addressing each of those briefly. One of them I put on there so shortly before we went on the air that my guess is that many of you, even if you are regular visitors to our Facebook page, probably have not had the opportunity to see this one as yet. It relates to the primaries today, more specifically to the Democratic primary. We've devoted so much attention, as the media does, to the Republican situation and to the escapades of Donald Trump and the efforts of mainstream Republicans to try to rein him in or follow him or fall into line or get him to fall into line or whatever your preference happens to be. I think there are people that will argue each and all of those. But our Facebook page is very easy to access. Just go to Facebook. If you are a regular user, just type in facebook.com. And then when you get to the home page, just go to the search box at the top and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be on our Facebook page. And the most recent entries will be the first ones you will come to, and then as you go down, they get earlier and earlier. They go back 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, whatever. There are a number of them on there. I've really enjoyed having access to the Facebook page. It has given me an opportunity to react, to respond to many of the things related to the current election, but many of the issues of the day. I sometimes get an inclination to sit down and react to them, and the existence of the Facebook page gives me the opportunity to do that. And that gives me an opportunity to share my thoughts and my thinking with those of you kind enough to visit our Facebook page and to check them out. What I want you to know is that I do welcome your reaction, your input, your response, your comments, or whatever. And however you choose, however you are most comfortable to make your comments is fine with me. Whether, in fact, it's right on the Facebook page where the Facebook program gives you the opportunity to comment, whether it's in a private personal message from you to me, because if you comment on what's on the Facebook page, everybody gets a chance to see it, of course, whereas if you message me directly, that's not true. I get it, but nobody else gets it. So you can really make your own choice there. If you'd like to call in on our phone line, 304-663-4676, and react to what's on our Facebook page that way, by all means, I encourage you to do that. Obviously, if you would like to send me an email at waobrien906@gmail.com. The point is there are a number of opportunities, a number of ways that we can interact, that we can exchange thoughts and exchange ideas on some important issues, not only of the day, but important issues from a former day that still live with us, that still live, so to speak. I think we found that as we've looked at the founders over the months, and we've looked at some of the work and some of the writing that the Jeffersons and the Madisons and the Washingtons and the Hamiltons and the rest of them have done. And I really do believe that we have found such substance, such depth there, that many of the issues they raised and many of the controversies they anticipated and expressed their opinions on still live. And the information that they give and the insights they provide are indeed still relevant and still important. And I've mentioned many times, and I'll say it again right here, I believe that we have, as a society, we have allowed ourselves to abandon the value of the past. I know that this is the historian in me speaking, but the fact of the matter is the value of good history, it seems to me, is that we can learn from it. We should learn from it. And I think what we've seen and done here at the Virtual Center with the founders has provided example after example of issues, places, and ways that we can all benefit from what the founders left us, what the founders gave us, and the hopes that the founders had for us and for this republic. So with that, I'd like to get into today's program. And of course, I will mention, as I'm sure you already know, that we began our program, as we usually do on Tuesdays, 30 minutes later than we usually do. So what that means is our program today will only be 1.5 hours rather than our full complement of 2 hours. Because of that, on Tuesdays, we usually forego the break at the top of the hour. We usually just roll right on through. And my anticipation, my plan is that we should be able to do that today. Of course, I'm getting to that point in my life where nature calls periodically, and I know it does in the 2-hour program without question. But for the most part, I've been able to hang in there pretty well on these 90-minute Tuesday programs, and I trust that we'll be able to do that as well. So before we get back into what we were dealing with at the end of yesterday's program, which relates specifically to Smedley Butler and the so-called coup that we talked about, I'd like to return and provide a little bit more information, a little bit more detail on that later in our program. But first, I'd like to visit a couple of the issues that seem to me relevant enough that I made a point to put them on Facebook. The first one is one we dealt with yesterday, an issue. It deals with the candidacy of Donald Trump, the Republican primary campaign, if you will. And more specifically, it deals with the issue that we addressed yesterday, which was the extent to which mainstream Republican leaders are or seem to be, as of yesterday, falling into line and very, very reluctant to criticize Donald Trump. As many of you know, the media is chock full over the last several days with information about the campaign, and I use that word advisedly, that Donald Trump is engaged in against the Judge Curiel, who has been assigned the Trump University case. And I made mention yesterday of, and put something on Facebook to that effect, that when Mitch McConnell appeared on Sunday talk shows, on George Stephanopoulos' program on ABC most specifically, when confronted by George Stephanopoulos about why the Republican leadership was not willing to take Donald on these racial comments related to the fact that this judge is of Hispanic descent and therefore unable to render an objective decision in the Trump University case. Mitch McConnell's response to George Stephanopoulos was that the party of Lincoln is mainly interested in winning the White House. We spent a little bit of time on this yesterday. And my point was that, in effect, it appears that the Republican leadership is more focused and more intent on pulling together and uniting behind the candidacy of Donald Trump for purposes of winning the election in November than anything else. So what Mitch McConnell's comment really suggests, of course, is that the issues associated with principle, ethics, morality, all the rest of it, seem to pale against the issue of winning the election in November. What Mitch McConnell basically was saying, it seems to me, was that the real issue, all they really care about is winning the election. All other issues are really a distant second to that principal issue, that priority. And I made a few comments yesterday about what that means about principle and ethics and shackling the reputation or the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, the party of Lincoln, with the racial comments coming out of Donald Trump's mouth on this issue, and how ironic it is that it happens to be Abraham Lincoln, the man noted for freeing the slaves, that the Republican leadership would not confront Donald Trump on some of these comments that he's making. Well, it's 24 hours later, and what we predicted yesterday is indeed coming to pass. And that is that one by one, many of these most prominent Republicans, Mitch McConnell included, Newt Gingrich, Reince Priebus, head of the Republican National Committee, and many, the Wall Street Journal, for example, the conservative mouthpiece in journalism. I think everybody would agree that the Wall Street Journal's position on political issues is pretty consistently Republican, pretty consistently conservative. The Wall Street Journal came out and criticized Donald Trump and criticized the racial overtones, the racial content of his comments. And we kind of predicted that yesterday because obviously the issue is so blatant that it really became clear that to not confront Donald Trump on these issues, on these comments, was to condone them. And that's really the issue that I think really tended to besmirch the reputation or the connections, if you will, between today's Republican Party and the party of Lincoln. One by one, as we predicted, Mitch McConnell, Newt Gingrich, Reince Priebus, the Wall Street Journal, and many of these others. I saw a column by Krauthammer this morning. They've taken Donald on these issues. And, of course, they're walking a very fine line, because while they want to distance themselves from the racial overtones of these comments that Donald Trump is making, at the same time, they don't want to break up or to do anything to challenge or to weaken the degree to which Republicans are falling into line behind the candidacy of Donald Trump. In other words, their goal remains winning elections. So the issue is, how do we stay united? How do we maintain our support for Trump and at the same time take him on again on these issues? So what we see is that Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, Newt Gingrich, and others have made very carefully crafted statements in which they take issue with the comments, but they really don't do anything to raise the more serious issue of supporting a Trump candidacy. And it's this that I thought our Facebook page almost demanded a follow-up to, and that's what I did earlier today. What I said was, it wasn't 12 hours ago that we addressed the issue of Donald Trump's racist comments about the judge assigned to the Trump University case. In that posting, in yesterday's posting, we predicted that the leadership of the Republican Party, one after the other, would jump on board the anti-Trump bandwagon on this issue. Well, we were right in our predictions. Today's news is full of statements from prominent Republicans seemingly eager to take the Donald to task for his continued jeremiad against Judge Gonzalo Curiel. Once the road was cleared, once it was politically safe to create some distance from Trump, politicos in droves scurried to take advantage of the opportunity. Seems like nobody wanted to go first, however. So much for principle. In these days of mourning, when Muhammad Ali is everyone's hero, it seems incoherent at best for so many of our leaders to seek political safety on an issue of such importance. Doesn't bode well for the nation's future, does it? Those we're asked to depend on are coming up short, it seems to me, when it counts the most. Clearly an insult to Ali, a wake-up call to Donald. The Wall Street Journal, long recognized as the media mouthpiece of conservative ideology, joined in the anti-Trump festivities. Supporting the need, and this is a quote from the New York Times, supporting the need to, quote, separate the odious from the just obnoxious. The Journal jumped headlong into the fray. One more source willing to throw Trump under the political bus on this issue. Now, all who care about image can point to the noble stand taken in defense of racial fairness. The political fallout, of course, lies at the doorstep of Donald Trump. His troops have abandoned him on this issue. He's been left alone to fend off the critics. If he's able to withstand this issue, as he's done so successfully on issues raised in the past, then his supporters will, of course, jump back on board. Democrats wonder aloud if Bernie Sanders supporters will fall into line behind Hillary. Her success in November depends on it. But Republicans have their own issue to worry about. Can they be sure that the Donald will stick to the script from here on? Or will he continue to behave in ways that reveal his realization that he's really in this all by himself? And I think that pretty much says what I believe, what I feel about this particular issue. I think it's very sensitive. This morning, in conversation about this, my wife and I were talking about this morning as we were getting ready for our day. And my wife made an observation, and I'll be very honest, I've neglected to tell her how perceptive I thought this observation was. It really was. As I say, we were just getting ready for the day, and having taken our showers and getting dressed for the day and all that. And this was on TV. We had, I think we had Morning Joe on the TV, as I recall, and they were talking about this particular issue. And the conversation they were having suggests that since yesterday, Donald Trump, this is their term, seems to have doubled down on this issue. His attacks on Judge Curiel are much more pointed, much more direct than they were before. And basically, his argument is that because he proposed the wall and because he said what he said about Hispanics, about Mexicans and other Latin Americans coming across the border, our open borders, and his solution to that, which is to build the wall, the very famous wall, his conclusion is there's no way that a judge of Hispanic heritage can be expected to rule fairly in a case with Donald Trump as the litigant. And, of course, Judge Curiel right now is set to hear the case against Trump University. And Donald Trump is arguing that the fact that Curiel is of Hispanic origin biases him against Donald Trump and against Trump University. My wife's comment was that it appeared to her like Trump was really laying down the groundwork for a negative finding against Trump University. What little, we don't know all the details, neither my wife nor I, but I think we both agree that from everything we've read, Trump University was as much, if not more, a scam than anything else. It was a moneymaker. The media and columnists are saying just that. So if you accept that, and we haven't done the research to really reach that conclusion, but if you do reach that conclusion, and if indeed that is the story, then chances are that no judge is going to find in favor of Trump University. In other words, this is a case that the Donald can't win. And therefore, the attacks that he's making on the bias of the judge in anticipation of a negative decision are really setting the stage for Donald Trump's ability to reject a negative finding by that court, charging bias on the part of the judge. In other words, that all of this is a calculated scheme by the Donald to set up an opportunity for him later on to accuse the judge of bias. So what he's doing is making those accusations before the case is even heard. I think that's a pretty good insight. Pretty perceptive. It seems to me it might indeed be valid. Who knows? But I think the real issue here for me at this point is not so much Trump University as much as it is the behavior of the leadership of the Republican Party. And again, I'll just make reference to what I made reference to yesterday in response to an issue raised some time ago. And that is the question, if you remember, during the period when there was some question about whether Paul Ryan would endorse Donald Trump's candidacy, we raised the question here as to whether the party leaders would fall into line behind Trump or whether Trump would fall into line behind them. The issue being that somehow the two were going to have to come together if they were to have any chance against the Democrats in November. I think the leadership of the Republican Party has behaved in ways on this racism issue that suggest clearly that the issue is that Donald is really calling the shots here. And these people are really following into line because they can't control him. What they find themselves doing is responding to him. And on this particular issue, they faced a crisis. They had to respond and they had to take issue with what he said, but at the same time, they didn't want to do it in such strong terms that they would cost the party the unity that it needs to win in November, if indeed it does have a chance of winning in November. I think that's the most significant issue here, and I think it's worth all of us kind of following. I think this is absolutely fantastic. And again, I think one of the criticisms at the end of the day over this entire primary election process is going to be the free press coverage, media coverage that Donald Trump was able to get day after day. He basically, was able to manipulate the day's news each day to the point that he was the lead item on every broadcast every day. Consequently, his bravado about funding his own campaign and not taking donations from wealthy donors turns out to be rather empty, because the fact of the matter is most of the media coverage he's gotten, he's not had to pay for. He has created his own news. He has made himself news on a consistent basis. And as such, he's received all this free publicity and all of this coverage. There's absolutely no question that the Republican campaign, primary campaign, has received so much coverage, so much attention from the media, as opposed to the Democratic campaign. And of course, that's been one of the arguments that the Bernie Sanders campaign folks have made, is that the mainstream of the Democratic Party, the Democratic National Committee, Debbie Wasserman Schultz and others, have really stacked the deck in favor of Hillary. And that's been one of Bernie's challenges or allegations all the way along. The second issue that I put on Facebook today, I made mention of in our today's program a little bit earlier, focuses on the Democratic primary. This one has some substance and some depth to it, I believe. In fact, I will say that at the very end of this posting on Facebook, I made the comment that for me personally, this was a tough one to write. But I'm feeling pretty confident now that the posting is there, now that I've done it. I think what I'm proposing is the best strategy. But it's difficult. And I think you'll understand, and I'll explain what I mean when we get into this. There was a piece in this morning's Charleston Gazette here in West Virginia, the state Democratic newspaper or liberal newspaper, by an author named Jim Waggy, who's a writer and a novelist and a columnist and a commentator on public issues and events. He has an editorial or an op-ed piece in today's newspaper in which he lays out the case for the importance of the Bernie Sanders campaign up to this point. He addresses the issues that Bernie has raised and the importance of those issues. I think we've done the same thing here on the Virtual Center in weeks gone by. Waggy's piece makes the case as to the extent to which Bernie's campaign has drawn attention to these issues. I put on Facebook the link to Wegge's article because I think it's one that all of us would do well to read. My comment was that now that Hillary seemingly has secured the requisite number of delegates to lock up the nomination, and I think at the very beginning of today's program, I mentioned that that's technically not true. Technically, she hasn't locked it up because the only way it's locked up is when you count the superdelegates. And the superdelegates don't officially vote until the convention. So in reality, we're still dealing with pledged delegates based on election results in the primaries. And while Hillary is leading significantly, the fact of the matter is she doesn't have enough delegates to lock it up. Not only that, and Bob and I chatted about this before we went on the air today, even if she gets all the remaining delegates, she still won't have enough to lock up the nomination. She'll need some support, albeit clearly not that much, from superdelegates in the convention. Bernie's campaign at this point seems to be based on the reality that since she hasn't locked it up yet, and since she can't really lock it up prior to the convention, then that means that the result is still in play. The election is still in play. My point is Wegge's piece on the issues that Bernie Sanders has raised. Basically, what I've said is now that it appears that the Democratic primary race is pretty much over, Democrats have some serious soul searching to do. Most especially, what's the best strategy to make sure that the issues Bernie has raised don't die once the race is over? In other words, if one accepts what Wegge says, and I do, because it's pretty much the same thing we shared here in the Virtual Center, Bernie has raised issues and has continued to focus on issues, driving home his points on some of the major issues. In effect, he has educated the electorate. He has educated the voting public on these issues, on what they mean, why they're important, how they relate to the mission of this republic, all of it. In other words, as a result of Bernie's campaign, more than any of the other campaigns, Republican or Democrat, Bernie has pretty much done what the pundits argue the election process itself is designed to do, which is to educate the voting public. Bernie has done that by focusing on issues when nobody else was. Not only that, but he did it so successfully that he really has forced his opponent, Hillary, to address those same issues. He has done such a masterful job of raising issues and educating the public on the importance of those issues that he has created a situation where his opponent can't really run away from those issues. She's had to deal with them. She's had to make concessions in her own stance in order to make sure that she doesn't alienate the people who are flocking to Bernie's campaign. Her challenge is obviously to win the nomination, but her real challenge is to win it and at the same time hold on to the support that Bernie's been able to generate. And in order to do that, she's got to pay more than lip service to the issues that Bernie has raised. And she's done that. Bernie has already had a significant a significant influence on the direction of this campaign by forcing the issues to the table and refusing to let anybody take them off the table. If the whole thing were to end right now, it seems to me historians would be forced to credit Bernie Sanders with making a significant contribution to the nation's political history. In previous postings, we've here at the Virtual Center, we've raised the issue of the very unique nature of Bernie's candidacy. Whereas the system itself drives voters to pay more and more attention to the character and personality of the candidates, less and less to the issues, Bernie has changed that game. In the past, many of the ideas that Bernie champions have been raised in previous campaigns. But for the most part, they've been raised by fringe candidates. They've been raised by candidates who really don't stand much chance of winning. Bernie changed that as well, because Bernie is not a fringe candidate. He may have been when the process began, but he has successfully made sure that if he was a fringe candidate at the beginning, he's not a fringe candidate now. He's a major competitor for the nomination. Consequently, what makes Bernie's campaign, I think, especially relevant is that he has taken issues that only fringe candidates in the past would dare to argue for, dare to support. And he has taken them and brought them front and center, got them onto the table, and made sure that they stayed there. Consequently, as never before, millions of voters and potential voters in this country are educated on issues that they never had a chance to be educated on before. I think that's incredible. I think it's a legacy that Bernie personally can be proud of. Bernie's not fringe, and no longer is what he stands for. He's done such a good job that he's forced other candidates to deal with his issues. Seems that the real question for Democrats then, in fact for thinking Republicans as well, is to identify the best way to keep these ideas alive. There's no question but that the survival of these ideas will depend on Democrats winning the election in November against Donald Trump. And if indeed Hillary is to be the nominee, then in order for these ideas, these issues to live, Hillary must win, it seems to me. Should Trump win, that spells the end of any chance for meaningful regulation of big banks and Wall Street behavior. It's the end of the day for any significant increase in the minimum wage, in health care for all, for a jobs program designed to refurbish the nation's infrastructure and at the same time put millions of Americans back to work, for protection of Social Security and Medicare benefits for senior citizens, the return of affordable college tuition, and so much more. In other words, all the things that Bernie has run on will be lost should Donald Trump win the election in November. But there's even more than that. Besides these specific issues, there are the more prophetic, the more philosophical ones, the more human ones. A Trump victory would also spell the end of respect for the Bill of Rights, for equal treatment of minorities and the disadvantaged, restoration of the American dream for citizens at large, and recognition that government exists for the benefit of all of its people, not just a privileged few of its people. No question, then, there are serious moral and ethical dimensions to the choices that all of us must make. Standing for principle would seem to dictate that Bernie or bust is the only way. I say that because in the deepest depths of my heart, I believe that. I believe that commitment to principle, commitment to the stand that Bernie has taken on many of these issues, would suggest that the issues are so important that if he's not there to champion them, then the best thing I can do to honor him is to write his name in on the ballot or to not vote at all. While that would appear to be principled, it would, the way I see it, literally cut off your nose to spite your face. Because writing in Bernie's name on the November ballot, or not voting at all, while it might seem the best way to make a point, is not. The way the cards are dealt in our election process, if Hillary does not win in November, then the Donald does. Pretty simple on one level. Pretty damn complicated on another level. I'm betting that Bernie himself would say, and I fully expect him to say it and do so soon, that what he's run on and stood for, the millions of young people that he's touched, and the important issues that he's raised, demand that we do what will respect each of these the most. Avoiding a Trump presidency would seem to be the best choice in each case. To avoid a Trump presidency, it seems to me, would do honor to the issues and the stands that Bernie's taken. It would do honor to the millions of young people who have come forward to become politically active in their support of Bernie Sanders and the issues that he has championed. And it would do justice to the issues themselves. It seems to me all of those things will only be enhanced by making sure that Donald Trump does not win in November. Consequently, the best way to honor what Bernie has done for the nation and for the people in it, I believe, is to preserve his legacy by staying active to make sure that his policies and his priorities are not allowed to fade into political nothingness. That means doing everything we can do to make sure that Democrats win in the fall, in November, and staying active in order to hold Democrats' feet to the fire, in order to make sure that the issues which were so important to Bernie become and remain issues that are important to the Democratic Party as a whole. And then I said, for me, this has been a tough one. Because in my heart, I really, really believe in what Bernie has stood for. But on the other hand, when I think about it, what he has stood, and I'm not, the text is over, what we've already done is on Facebook. I'm just making observations here at this point. It seems to me one of the things that Bernie has done is make these issues bigger than himself. What I feel to be principled, what I feel I would like most to do, is to stand with Bernie right to the end. But the fact is, if that's going to cause the loss of what he stood for, then I think that's counterproductive. And I think in the long run, that would be a disservice to Bernie. That's kind of what I believe. Obviously, that is opinion. If there was ever anything on the virtual center that one could define as opinion, that's it. Because obviously everyone must make their own choice, must make their own decision. Once I thought about this issue, once I made a determination that this issue really ought to be raised on Facebook, on the Facebook page, once I made the decision to do it and began to wrestle with these issues myself, I made my decision. And I think I'm comfortable with it. I really do. But on the other hand, I do respect those who might disagree with me. The only thing I urge that I'm concerned about is that while I respect principle, we talked about that with the Republican campaign, the fact that the leaders of the Republican Party seem to have abandoned principle in order to win the election. And I was critical of that. It seems to me a little bit contradictory and hypocritical on my part to criticize Republicans for their willingness to abandon principle and then make an argument that in some ways Democratic voters should do the same thing. But the fact of the matter is, it seems to me there's short term and long term. The long term, the one that really matters, it seems to me, are the issues themselves and what chance they might have to become policy, to become law in this republic and actually benefit people. In the long term, that's the most important thing. And so it seems to me winning the election in November for Democrats, for me, is a means to an end rather than an end. For me, the end is the program, are the issues. The means to get those issues on the table and keep them there is to win the election. For Republicans, it seems to me winning the election, as Mitch McConnell said on George Stephanopoulos' program on Sunday, for Republicans, winning the election is the be-all and end-all of what Republicans are about. And things like principle and ethics and morality and all the rest of it, in Mitch McConnell's way of thinking, take a back seat to winning the election. My feeling is the major things are the election. I think that's what Bernie has done, it seems to me, is raise these issues. The election then becomes a means to make sure that these issues live and that these issues have a chance to be successful. That's the choice that I've made. That's the decision I've reached. But I do acknowledge, I do admit that it's not an easy one. It's one that I ask everybody to think seriously about and make their own call. We have reached the bottom of the hour. It's just about approaching half past the hour, which means we've got about 30 minutes left in our program today. And I'd like to use it to go back and share a few things from yesterday's program that we addressed at the very end. I seem to be getting some coughing issues here today, and I apologize for that. Yesterday, in the last 15 minutes of our program, I shared with you excerpts from a speech by Smedley Butler. At the end of the program, I kind of thought to myself, well, that might have been what I was thinking of with just 15 minutes left. This was really a chance to end the program on a high by raising an issue of intrigue, an issue that would really interest people. What linguists sometimes call the hook, or an issue that was so interesting that those people tuned in would want to know more. But after the program was over and I looked back on it, I thought, my heavens, that might have been very unfair, because I didn't have the time to lay out any context or any explanation or understanding of where Smedley Butler came from, or where this issue came from, or why it was important, except to make a couple of general comments about Roosevelt's New Deal program in the election of 1932. So I thought that today, pending the fact that we would have a little bit more time than that, and we do, we have about a half hour left in today's program, I thought I would go back and lay out the issue, the context within which this reputed coup, and I say coup advisedly, and I also say reputed advisedly, because there were an awful lot of prominent voices in that at that time who deny the existence of anything resembling a coup. I made the comment yesterday as introduction to this issue that there have been in our past evidences of situations and issues like this which have arisen before in America's history. They are issues that don't get much visibility. They are issues that don't make it into the textbooks. They're issues that many people find uncomfortable. They're issues that many people don't want our young people to even know about, to be very honest with you. So by repressing these issues, by making sure that they don't make it into the textbooks, by making sure that book publishers redact anything making reference to any of these activities, The result has been that generation after generation of young people take courses in American history, history of their own country, while at the same time they miss significant aspects of that history. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's pretty good background, and it kind of lays out a scenario which will make the Smedley Butler story much more meaningful. Here in the virtual center, in the distant past, we have made reference more than once to an event which I have called, which historians call, the Newburgh Conspiracy. When I ran across references to this during my research at the time of the American Revolution, early in the Confederation period, well before the Constitution of the United States was even thought about, I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. And part of the reason was that so few of the sources, secondary sources, that I had looked at on this period even made mention of the Newburgh Conspiracy. So the more information I was able to collect on it, the more intrigued I was. Let me give you a little bit of the context. It is early 1783. The war for American independence has been going on since 1775 with April, with Concord and the battles of Concord and Lexington. But those of us who are familiar with at all the military history of the war in American independence will recall that the outcome of the war pretty much was determined in October of 1781 when Cornwallis was defeated at Yorktown. For all practical purposes, the worst aspects of the war ended in late 1781. But the reality is, the peace treaty ending the war wasn't signed until April of 1783, a year and a half later, a year and a half after the Battle of Yorktown. So the question is, what took so long? What took so long in sitting down at the table and concluding this war, which would produce American independence? Many historians have looked at this issue. Many of them studied the negotiations in Europe surrounding the peace treaty. Many people came away from that research extremely impressed with the performance of Benjamin Franklin to negotiate a treaty that was beneficial to what became the United States of America. Most people focused on the internals of the debates going on in Europe, because the fact of the matter is we were at war with Great Britain, but from 1778 on, we had an alliance, a treaty with France. And in that treaty, we had pledged that we would not negotiate an end to the war without the French being with us. In other words, we would not undertake secret diplomatic meetings with Great Britain and reach a conclusion of the war and thereby leave France hanging out there, having declared war at Great Britain in support of our independence. We pledged ourselves to honor our treaty commitments to France. And the diplomacy associated with working out a treaty between Britain, the former colonies, and France, and then including the Dutch and including Spain, became a very complicated, complex, involved process. Without getting into details, I call your attention to an early study, a study that was done over a century ago by a diplomatic historian named Samuel Flagg Bemis, B-E-M-I-S. Samuel Flagg Bemis, in his Diplomacy of the American Revolution, lays out the details of a very complicated back and forth negotiation, which focuses principally on the behavior and the activities and the shrewd abilities of Benjamin Franklin to play one side against the other in these negotiations. To make a long story short, there's no question that American independence, Britain's willingness to grant American independence at the end of this war, was driven principally not by the fact that we had defeated Britain in the war, but by the reality Britain saw its diplomatic future with the nations of Europe to be enhanced by American independence. Great Britain believed that its power and influence in Europe would be enhanced by American independence. We won our independence principally because the mother country began to realize that our independence was in her best interest diplomatically. That's the reason she gave in, it appears. So that's really the process that consummated the year and a half from Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown to the consummation of the peace treaty of April 1783. Early in 1783, then, most people believed that the war, for all practical purposes, was over. And what most people were waiting for was the peace treaty to be signed so that the war was officially over. And there's no group of people that waited more eagerly for the peace treaty than the soldiers in Washington's Continental Army. After the defeat at Yorktown, Washington brought the Continental Army back to its headquarters along the Hudson in New York, near the town of Newburgh, New York. For those of you who have driven to New England from the south and have driven north on Interstate 81 to Scranton and then turned east on Interstate 84 into New England, 84 runs east through Pennsylvania into New York, across the Hudson, into Connecticut, and then north through Hartford and connects with the Massachusetts Turnpike, which runs directly east into Boston. I've driven it many times. Those of you who have will know that on Interstate 84, as you pass from Pennsylvania into the state of New York, one of the first exit signs you see is for Newburgh. Newburgh is where Washington's Continental Army was headquartered, awaiting official word that the war was over so that they could go home. Fact of the matter is, when you have literally hundreds, if not thousands of troops quartered together, not doing anything, just waiting for the war to be over, you've got the makings of a potentially volatile situation. What made the situation volatile was that the Continental Congress did not have the money to pay the troops. And instead, the Congress was paying them in public securities, in what we call today IOUs. When word began to spread through the troops that there was a likelihood that they would not get paid because Congress didn't have the power to pay them, because Congress didn't have the power to tax, there was the makings of a coup. Within the Continental Army, a group of leaders began to organize a movement which was designed to march the army on Philadelphia, which is where the Continental Army was based, and imprison the Continental Congress until Congress responded with legislation guaranteeing them the means to get paid. Literally, this was a potential takeover of the newly independent United States by the military. But I think all of us realize that movements like this don't usually begin on their own. Somebody starts them. Somebody plants the rumors. In this case, we know who the somebodies are. One of the most significant people involved is Alexander Hamilton, who, as many people know, was Washington's aide-de-camp in the War for Independence. Another person involved was an officer in the Continental Army named John Armstrong, who was second in command to Horatio Gates, who was the commander of the Continental Army, or the general for the Continental Army under Washington. There's no question that they were directly involved in starting the rumors which led to the prospective coup. Others involved: Robert Morris, financier of the United States. Robert Morris was the financial genius behind the Continental Congress's ability to fight this war and fund it without any money. It was Robert Morris who had the commercial contacts in Europe to negotiate the loans necessary to bring money to fight the war from the Dutch, from the French, from the Spanish, and for others. There are many people who will claim that Robert Morris, more than anyone else, single-handedly financed the war for American independence. The fact of the matter is, however, that when all the documents became known, when the evidence was in, it became pretty clear that the War for American Independence financed Robert Morris. The reason this is significant is because at the end of his life, Robert Morris dies without a penny. He was a big investor, a big risk taker, a big money raiser, and a big spender. So you had John Armstrong, a military man, Alexander Hamilton, a New York attorney and politician, an aide-de-camp to General Washington, Robert Morris, the financier of the Continental Congress. And if you study this period, you find that as early as 1781, the same year that Yorktown occurred in October, Robert Morris, Alexander Hamilton, and others in the Continental Congress began to push legislation to try to arrange to give Congress the ability to tax. Most specifically, in 1781, legislation was introduced in the Continental Congress called the Impost of 1781. The impost was a tariff on imported goods from overseas. The idea was to tax foreign goods shipped to the United States to the American colonies for sale, the American states now, for sale, to tax them and have that revenue go to the Continental Congress to fund the war and begin to pay off the debts that the war incurred. The impost came very close to passing. It was pushed by people like Hamilton, who were desperate to strengthen the central government, who were desperate to change the Articles of Confederation and give the Congress power that it didn't have, powers that the Articles of Confederation reserved for the states. These nationalists, once the impost of 1789 was defeated, began to look very, very carefully at their prospects for strengthening the central government. And what they realized is that once the peace treaty was signed, once independence had been won, then all chance of making substantial changes in the Articles of Confederation would be gone. They realized that only the pressures of the war itself could create the kind of environment which gave an amendment to the Articles a chance. Consequently, what we find is that a whole group of political leaders, prominent politicians, prominent merchants in New York and Philadelphia, prominent bank interests and financiers, and commercial interests with outlets throughout the world, began to recognize that the worst thing that could happen for their nationalist goals of strengthening the central government was the end of the war. They had a vested interest to delay peace, in other words, and they were able to do it. But by early 1783, they were getting word from Europe that Benjamin Franklin was very close to consummating a final treaty, ending the war and granting American independence, as well as the borders of Canada in the north and Mississippi River in the west, and the northern border of Florida in the south. In other words, the American cause was gaining most of its objectives. Of course, most people didn't realize that the reason they were getting them is because Great Britain had begun to realize that it was in her best interests that we should get those things. Because England saw that its future rivals, France, Spain, etc., needed to be kept at bay. And the way to keep them at bay was with an independent United States of America. It was at this time then, in early 1783, that Hamilton, Robert Morris, Armstrong, and the rest of them began to plant rumors in the military about the soldiers not being paid, creating the kind of military force that they could use literally in order to capture the Congress of the United States and force the kind of reforms that they felt the nation needed and that they knew would be gone forever once the peace treaty was consummated. At the 11th hour, Washington himself got wind of this coup, called the officers together, and according to the sources, to the people that were there, made one of the most impassioned pleas for loyalty to the new nation ever made. There's no question that Washington personally was able to pull the plug on this coup. What he did, of course, was make direct contact with the leaders of the Continental Congress, basically asking them, what the hell are you guys doing? And suggesting, I'll do my part if you do yours. Fact of the matter is, the coup at the 11th hour was ended. But indeed, it did happen. It is a matter of historical record. It's not in the textbooks. But if you go on the internet, on Google, and you type in the Newburgh Conspiracy, 1783, you will find the story of this coup, of this conspiracy. The point I'm making is that whenever a situation like this happens, there are people whose interests, whose vested interests, whose self-interest will be benefited by one outcome over the other. There's absolutely no question that at the time of the New Deal, Roosevelt's election and defeat of Hoover in the election of 1932, Roosevelt was promising jobs, massive government spending. Roosevelt was laying out not the groundwork of, because it was clear that Roosevelt didn't have a clear, defined plan. He was speculating on some of the things that his administration would have to do if he won the election of 1932. What he was promising the American people was that he would do something. And what he was accusing Hoover of is not doing anything. And that was the basis on which the election was contested in 1932, and Roosevelt was elected. Many of the prominent leaders of business in America, corporate leaders, were petrified by some of the things that Roosevelt was promising. Consequently, the evidence suggests that many prominent corporate leaders and financiers began to meet secretly in order to plan a coup for purposes of derailing the New Deal and derailing the Roosevelt administration before it had an opportunity to enact its program. And as in 1783, the success of this effort depended on being able to involve the military in the takeover. And the key person that was deemed most likely to cooperate and the most likely to guarantee its success was Smedley Butler. Smedley Butler was a career military man. He was a major general in the Marine Corps. He appeared in 1932 to speak to the bonus army camped out in Washington trying to get the pay for the military. It was at that point that Butler began to champion the cause of the soldiers and began to criticize the self-interest of corporations who were looking out for themselves rather than the best interests of the country. One of the things that many of these corporate interests and financiers were worried about was Roosevelt's promise to take the nation off the gold standard. They felt that this would be very dangerous. They began to talk amongst themselves about fears of socialism, reckless government spending, communism, radicalism, all of these ideas, all of these dangerous ideas, which seemed to be at the heart of what Roosevelt was promising. Many of the same things, by the way, that Bernie Sanders has been talking about in 2016. A book was written on this particular issue by Jules Archer called The Plot to Seize the White House. In that book, Jules Archer wrote that it was the end of the gold standard that worried those involved in the plot most. And this is a quote from Jules Archer's book, The Plot to Seize the White House. Quote, "Conservative financiers were horrified. They viewed a currency not solidly backed by gold as inflationary, undermining both private and business fortunes and leading to national bankruptcy. Roosevelt was damned as a socialist or a communist out to destroy private enterprise by sapping the gold backing of wealth in order to subsidize the poor," unquote. Sound familiar? That's really the way that these people painted what Roosevelt was promising in his New Deal. After the election, the issue of the coup became public knowledge. Congress created a special committee headed up by John McCormick of Massachusetts and Representative Dick Steen. And the McCormick-Dick Steen Committee began to hold hearings. In 1934, they began to examine evidence. On November 20th, 1934. On November 24th, this committee of Congress released a statement detailing the testimony it had heard about the plot and its preliminary findings. On February 15th, 1935, the committee submitted its final report to the House of Representatives. Appearing before the McCormick-Dickstein Committee was Smedley Butler, who testified that Gerald C. McGuire had attempted to recruit him to lead a coup, promising him an army of 500,000 men for a march on Washington, D.C., and the financial backing to pull it off. Butler testified that the pretext for the coup would be that President Roosevelt's health was failing. Butler was picked because of his reputation as a career military man. During his testimony before the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, Butler implicated several prominent businessmen and veteran leaders as backers of the plot. Given a successful coup, Butler said, the plan was for him to have held near absolute power in the newly created position of Secretary of General Affairs, while President Roosevelt would have been reduced to the role of a figurehead. Those implicated in the plot by Butler all denied any involvement. McGuire was the only figure identified by Butler who testified before the committee. The committee did not call anybody else. Others that Butler accused were not called because, quote, the committee has had no evidence before it that would in the slightest degree warrant calling before it such men. The committee will not take cognizance of names brought into testimony which constitute mere hearsay. In effect, what the committee decided was that these people being named by Butler were too important and too influential to be called. I've got run over, and I really apologize. We've gone way over. It is 3 minutes after the hour, and I apologize. I think I got kind of into this. Thank you, and we'll be back tomorrow.